You won't believe what showed up on my porch one rainy morning, Mason said to himself, peering out at the drizzle coating the quiet suburban street. The sky was a dull gray, clouds hanging low as if the world itself were holding its breath. Mason had just moved into his new home, a modest two-story house with a small fenced yard, and while the unpacking was still a mess, he had been craving companionship ever since leaving the city life behind. As he opened the front door, a tiny, shivering puppy with unusually dark fur and eyes that seemed far too knowing for its size stared back at him. Its little tail wagged cautiously, almost as if it were measuring whether Mason could be trusted. Mason bent down slowly, holding out his hand, and the puppy hesitated for a moment before inching closer, its tiny paws making soft tapping sounds against the wet wooden porch. "Hey there, little one," Mason whispered, his voice breaking the quiet of the morning. The puppy tilted its head in a way that made Mason feel an odd sense of connection, almost like it recognized something in him that nobody else did. Without warning, the puppy darted around the porch in a circle, stopping to stare intently at the house, and Mason couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just curiosity. It was awareness, a keen sense of something just beyond the ordinary. He knelt down, reaching toward it, and for a moment their eyes locked, a silent understanding passing between them. Mason chuckled nervously, unsure why his heart was pounding harder than it should for a simple meeting with a dog. He had adopted pets before, but this little creature carried a presence he couldn't explain. Shadow, as he decided to name it, hesitated at the doorway before stepping inside, sniffing the air with precision, almost inspecting every corner with an intelligence that seemed unusual for a puppy. Mason followed slowly, carrying a towel to dry off the wet fur, and every movement the puppy made drew his attention. It pawed at the carpet, tilted its head toward the staircase, and even glanced back at Mason as if to silently guide him, giving off the impression that this wasn't a random puppy, but one that had purpose. Mason set the towel down, and Shadow immediately curled up on it, eyes half closed but ears still twitching at the smallest sounds in the room. Mason took a seat on the couch, observing the puppy, noticing subtle movements, a lift of the paw, a slight shift in posture, a focused stare out the window that seemed to indicate awareness beyond the usual. The air in the house felt different, charged in a way that made Mason acutely aware of every creak of the floorboards and rustle from outside. Even as he tried to distract himself by unpacking a few boxes, his gaze kept returning to Shadow, who seemed to be silently taking inventory of the entire home. It was both comforting and unnerving at the same time. Mason's mind began to wander to the possibilities. A companion, yes, but perhaps something more. He reached out and scratched behind Shadow's ears, and the puppy leaned into the touch, a soft whine escaping. But it wasn't fear. It was a reassurance, a signal of trust. Mason smiled, feeling a warmth he hadn't anticipated, but a twinge of apprehension lingered in his chest. There was something about the puppy's presence that made him alert, as if it were quietly watching not only him but the house itself, measuring unseen boundaries and testing for anything unusual. As the morning sunlight began to pierce through the clouds, streaking across the living room floor, Mason couldn't help but feel that this encounter was far from ordinary. Shadow, the strange puppy, had appeared on his porch seemingly by chance, yet the depth in its eyes and the precision in its movements told him otherwise. It was a puppy, yes, but Mason's intuition whispered that there was more to this small creature than met the eye, a hidden story waiting to unfold, and an unexpected journey that would begin the moment he stepped fully into this new chapter of his life. The morning unfolded with Mason moving carefully through the living room, arranging a few boxes that had been left unpacked from the previous day while keeping a watchful eye on Rogue. The puppy had taken to exploring every corner with a deliberate curiosity, sniffing corners, nudging the edges of furniture, and occasionally pausing to stare out the windows as if reading some invisible signal beyond the glass. Mason could not help but notice how precise Rogue's movements were. The puppy was small, yet there was an unspoken confidence in each step it took, a quiet intensity that made Mason feel both intrigued and cautious. He placed a fresh water bowl on the kitchen floor, and Rogue approached it, drinking in measured sips while keeping his ears angled toward every faint noise, from the creak of the floorboards to the distant hum of a lawnmower outside. Mason observed this behavior and felt a growing sense of awe mixed with unease. It was as if Rogue was absorbing the environment, cataloging it in a way that far exceeded the instincts of an ordinary puppy. Mason decided to take Rogue outside into the backyard, a small fenced area with patches of grass and a few scattered garden ornaments. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of wet earth from the drizzle that had passed earlier, and Rogue's paws sank slightly into the soft ground as he trotted ahead, pausing periodically to look back at Mason, checking that he was following. Mason noted how alert Rogue appeared, with eyes scanning every direction and ears rotating as though detecting movements invisible to human senses. It was captivating, yet Mason could not deny that he was beginning to feel the weight of responsibility for this creature. There was something about the puppy that suggested unpredictability, yet also a potential that was both protective and attentive. He placed a few toys on the lawn, and Rogue investigated each with care, sniffing, nudging, and occasionally picking up one only to drop it strategically, always maintaining awareness of the surroundings. Mason could see a pattern emerging in the way Rogue interacted with the yard, moving from one area to another with deliberate attention, as if performing a silent inspection. By mid-morning, Mason decided to prepare breakfast, moving into the kitchen while Rogue followed closely, his tail wagging in a controlled manner, never overly playful, always maintaining a watchful posture. Mason poured cereal into a bowl, and Rogue remained on the rug, eyes fixed on him, ears twitching at every sound, seemingly aware of each movement in the kitchen. Mason spoke gently to Rogue, asking if he was hungry, and the puppy tilted his head before trotting toward a small dish he had set earlier, eating carefully and methodically. After finishing, Rogue sat back and observed Mason, almost as though evaluating his routine and habits, learning and understanding more than Mason had anticipated. The sunlight continued to shift across the floor, casting long lines of light that Rogue seemed to acknowledge with a brief glance, pausing as though processing the changes in illumination. Mason walked to the sliding glass door to check the mailbox, and Rogue followed, standing silently by his side, watching the street with an intensity that Mason found increasingly remarkable. The ordinary suburban morning had taken on a new tone, one charged with the presence of a companion who was not ordinary, whose awareness and behavior suggested a depth and subtlety that Mason could feel in every glance, every posture, every cautious movement. The sense of normalcy was present, but layered underneath was a tension, a quiet expectation that something significant was waiting to unfold, and Mason could not help but feel that Rogue's strange attentiveness was a prelude to events that would challenge his understanding of what it meant to share a life with a creature that seemed to be more than what it appeared to be. As the day progressed, Mason began to notice patterns in Rogue's behavior that were both fascinating and perplexing. Each time Mason moved from one room to another, the puppy seemed to anticipate his steps, often arriving moments before him or pausing at doorways, as if assessing each path he intended to take. Rogue's ears perked up at the faintest of sounds, a distant car, a bird landing on the fence, or the subtle creak of a neighboring house settling. Mason could not shake the feeling that the puppy was not only aware of him, but also of everything surrounding the house, every detail large or small. He decided to observe Rogue more closely, following him quietly as he explored the kitchen and living area. The puppy would stop, tilt his head, sniff the air, with delicate precision, and sometimes even paw at corners or objects in a manner that suggested comprehension rather than simple curiosity. Mason was captivated, watching Rogue's intelligence unfold in subtle ways that a typical puppy would not display. At one point, Mason stepped onto the porch to take in the view of the street and the neighboring houses, and Rogue followed immediately, sitting alert at his feet, eyes scanning the perimeter as if protecting him and the home simultaneously. Mason spoke softly, trying to engage him in simple commands, but Rogue's attention was divided, half on Mason, half on the environment around them, reacting to every shifting shadow and sound. It was clear that the puppy had a heightened awareness, a sense of his surroundings that Mason had never encountered with any pet before. Later, Mason attempted to play with Rogue, tossing a small ball across the yard, expecting the usual enthusiastic chase, but Rogue approached it cautiously, sniffed it, then sat back to observe Mason's reaction, as if waiting for a cue. Mason realized that Rogue was studying him as much as the surroundings, gauging the energy, the intentions, and possibly preparing for something he did not yet understand. Each small action, from the tilt of his ears to the precision of his steps across the yard, conveyed a level of thoughtfulness that Mason found both thrilling and slightly unsettling. He could sense a quiet intelligence behind Rogue's eyes, a deliberate control over every motion, every glance, every pause. Mason walked toward the back fence, and Rogue mirrored his movements exactly, stopping when he stopped, looking to Mason for acknowledgement before moving again. The connection between them was deepening rapidly, yet Mason felt a sense of anticipation, as if the puppy was silently building toward a revelation, a moment of insight into something hidden or extraordinary. Mason noticed how Rogue reacted to subtle changes in light, the movement of clouds across the sky, the rustling of the trees, and even the distant sound of a neighbor walking across the yard. It was not simply playfulness or alertness. It was purpose, a quiet intensity that Mason could feel resonating through his own awareness. Mason paused by the fence, kneeling slightly to make eye contact, and Rogue sat perfectly still, eyes unwavering, focusing on him and then sweeping over the yard with deliberate attention. Every instinct Mason had told him that Rogue was extraordinary, that there was a depth to this puppy that had not yet revealed itself, and that each movement, each gaze, each pause was part of an intricate pattern Mason was only beginning to perceive. The ordinary routines of breakfast, walks, and chores had taken on a new dimension, colored by Rogue's subtle but deliberate presence. Mason could not help but feel that they were on the threshold of discovering something remarkable, a truth quietly encoded in the puppy's behavior, something that had been waiting for the right moment to emerge, and that his careful observation would be the key to understanding what Rogue had silently been preparing him to witness. By mid-afternoon, Mason could feel a subtle shift in Rogue's behavior that made him pause and take notice more than ever before. The puppy had been following his routine closely all morning, anticipating each movement, and now there was a new intensity in his eyes, a focus that seemed directed not just at Mason, but at the corners and thresholds of the house itself. As Mason moved from the living room to the hallway, Rogue mirrored his path precisely, pausing occasionally to sniff or tilt his head in ways that suggested careful assessment of their environment. Mason's attention was fully captured by this display. Every step the puppy took seemed intentional, deliberate, as if he were orchestrating some silent inspection. Shadows from the late afternoon sun stretched across the floor, and Rogue adjusted his position repeatedly, aligning his body to maintain a clear view of both Mason and the yard beyond the windows. Mason could not help but wonder what the puppy was observing, sensing an intelligence that was far beyond the curiosity typical of young animals. He brought a few small objects from the kitchen, paper cups, a ball, and a rolled-up magazine, and placed them at different points along the floor to test Rogue's reaction. Each time Rogue approached one, he paused, sniffed carefully, and sometimes nudged it with his nose or pawed at it lightly, yet always in a controlled, measured manner. It was as if he were cataloging the objects, understanding their significance, and considering their potential impact on the space. Mason watched closely, feeling both admiration and a tinge of unease at the precision of Rogue's actions. Later, Mason carried a small tray of snacks to the patio and sat down to enjoy the warm sunlight filtering through the glass door. Rogue trotted beside him, sitting quietly, eyes scanning the surrounding trees and fence line, alert to every subtle movement of wind-blown leaves or distant sounds of passing cars. Mason spoke gently, offering a small treat, and the puppy accepted it slowly, pausing between bites to glance back at Mason as if communicating silently that he was attentive to more than just the food. It was clear that Rogue's focus extended beyond simple play. There was an awareness, a watchfulness that Mason had never encountered, a readiness to react to anything unusual. The breeze carried faint scents from the neighboring yards, and Rogue's ears flicked at every shift in sound, his posture subtly changing to accommodate the information. Mason felt a growing awareness of being observed not only by the puppy, but by the energy the puppy carried throughout the house. Time passed almost unnoticed as Mason and Rogue moved through the afternoon together, routines blending with the extraordinary level of attentiveness that Rogue displayed. Mason could feel a quiet tension building, a sense that each observation, Each movement by Rogue was a prelude to a revelation that had not yet presented itself. By the time the sun began to dip lower toward the horizon, casting warm amber light across the floor, Mason realized that the ordinary sense of home and afternoon quiet had transformed into an experience charged with expectation. Every glance from Rogue, every measured step, every pause and tilt of the head contributed to an atmosphere in which Mason felt simultaneously connected, cautious, and increasingly aware that there was more to this puppy than he had ever anticipated. The day's ordinary rhythm had been replaced by something richer, something that hinted at a hidden depth and purpose within Rogue's actions, an intelligence and attentiveness that seemed to promise an important discovery in the near future, and Mason could sense that the puppy's behavior was guiding him toward it, one deliberate movement at a time. As the evening approached, Mason decided to prepare a light snack in the kitchen while Rogue remained close by, moving quietly from one side of the room to the other, eyes scanning and ears alert. There was an intensity in Rogue's movements that Mason could no longer ignore, a purpose behind each careful step that suggested observation beyond normal puppy behavior. Mason set down a small plate of food on the counter, and Rogue approached cautiously, pausing to look up at Mason with a steady gaze, almost as if confirming permission before taking a single careful bite. After finishing, Rogue stepped back, sitting upright and tilting his head as he stared at the far corner of the living room. Mason followed his gaze and noticed subtle movements that he had overlooked before, shadows shifting with the fading light, the gentle sway of a small houseplant, the quiet hum of the refrigerator, and the soft creak of the floorboards as the house settled. Rogue moved deliberately toward the corner, sniffing the air with precision, pausing frequently to adjust his stance and orientation, never hurrying but clearly attentive to details Mason could barely detect. Mason felt a mixture of admiration and unease. The puppy's focus was unwavering, his awareness meticulous, and every motion seemed to have an underlying rationale that Mason did not yet comprehend. Rogue paused at a small gap in the living room rug, staring intently at a faint pattern in the weave, then looked back at Mason as if to draw his attention without a sound. Mason knelt beside him, trying to understand what had captured the puppy's interest, and noticed that the angle of the evening sunlight created a reflection that danced subtly across the rug, highlighting areas that Rogue seemed to consider significant. He could sense the puppy's patience, the way Rogue took time to assess, to measure, to consider each aspect of the environment before making the smallest adjustment. Mason continued to observe, moving slowly toward the kitchen table while Rogue mirrored each step, pausing as Mason paused, tilting his head at the same intervals Mason did. The quiet tension in the house grew with every passing minute, the ordinary hum of appliances and the soft creak of wood creating a backdrop against which Rogue's deliberate movements felt almost ceremonial. Mason reached out to offer a gentle pat on Rogue's head, and the puppy leaned into the touch briefly, then immediately resumed his watchful stance, ears alert to the faintest disturbances outside the room. The wind shifted slightly, carrying scents from the backyard, and Rogue responded instantly, pivoting to face the door, nostrils flaring, tail moving in subtle alignment with his body, maintaining an unwavering attention that seemed to encompass the entire house. Mason felt a quiet anticipation building within him, a sense that the puppy was preparing for something significant, a revelation that was yet to unfold but was being carefully orchestrated in each measured action. As the sun dipped lower, casting longer shadows across the floor, Mason realized that every movement, every glance, every pause from Rogue had been leading to a moment of understanding, a subtle unveiling of awareness and purpose that Mason had only begun to appreciate. He felt a deep connection forming, a silent communication, a sense that the puppy was not only present in the moment, but guiding Mason toward an insight that would change the way he perceived the household, the environment, and the extraordinary presence of Rogue within it. As twilight settled over the neighborhood, Mason noticed a change in Rogue that made his pulse quicken with anticipation. The puppy, which had spent the entire day moving with deliberate attention, now paused at the far end of the living room and tilted his head as if listening to an imperceptible sound. Mason approached cautiously, curious and slightly anxious, feeling that something significant was about to reveal itself. Rogue's eyes, usually calm and intelligent, now glowed with a sharp awareness, fixed on the area near the entryway. Mason's mind raced, trying to guess what could be so important, but all he could see was the ordinary arrangement of furniture and the dim light casting shadows across the floor. Then, Rogue took a measured step forward, paws moving silently, and stopped near a small vent at the base of the wall. He sniffed carefully, glancing back at Mason, as though asking for acknowledgement, and Mason nodded slightly, holding his breath. In the next moment, Rogue began a pattern of behavior that Mason had not seen before. He pawed at the floor, circled the vent, and then darted toward a corner of the room, stopping to look intently at a small pile of boxes Mason had not yet unpacked. Each movement was precise, deliberate, and purposeful, as if guiding Mason to notice something he had overlooked. Mason followed, eyes wide, trying to keep pace with the puppy's calculated motions, and as he reached the corner, he discovered a faint glimmer beneath the boxes, an object that had gone unnoticed amidst the clutter. Rogue barked softly, not out of alarm, but as a signal, drawing Mason's attention to the anomaly. Mason bent down and carefully moved the boxes aside, revealing a small, intricately designed package that had been tucked away and forgotten. The realization struck him suddenly. Rogue had not simply been curious or playful all day. Every action had been leading Mason to this very moment, directing his attention to something important and hidden. His heart raced as he carefully lifted the package, noting the weight, the texture, and the sense that it contained something extraordinary. Rogue sat back, eyes fixed on Mason with a quiet satisfaction, as if acknowledging that the task had been completed successfully. Mason carefully opened the package, and his eyes widened in shock as he saw the contents. An object both delicate and unusual, something that explained Rogue's attentiveness and the seemingly intelligent behavior he had exhibited throughout the day. The puppy stepped closer, nudging the package gently with his nose, signaling not only that he had been guiding Mason but also that there was trust in his judgment and intentions. Mason's pulse quickened, a mixture of amazement, gratitude, and respect washing over him as he realized that Rogue's actions had been far more purposeful and extraordinary than any ordinary puppy could manage. Each observation, each subtle movement throughout the day had built toward this revelation, the culmination of Rogue's patience, awareness, and silent communication. Mason looked at the puppy, understanding now that Rogue was not only an extraordinary companion but a guide, an alert, and a protector, revealing a depth of intelligence and care that Mason had never anticipated. The twilight lights softened across the room, highlighting the gentle rise and fall of Rogue's chest as he watched Mason examine the discovery. And in that quiet moment, Mason felt a profound connection to the puppy, a recognition that the day's events had been a careful orchestration by Rogue, leading to a moment of insight and understanding that Mason would never forget. As Mason carefully examined the discovery, a wave of emotions swept over him, and he could feel the full weight of the moment pressing in from every angle. His heart raced with astonishment and a subtle nervousness, realizing that Rogue's deliberate guidance throughout the day had led him to something entirely unexpected, something that demanded his full attention and respect. Rogue sat patiently at his side, eyes unwavering, reflecting an almost human-like understanding that Mason had never encountered in any other animal. The realization that the puppy had been orchestrating the discovery, anticipating each of Mason's steps, and subtly guiding him without a single misstep, left Mason both humbled and overwhelmed. He took a deep breath, steadying his hands as he gently turned the object in his fingers, noting the intricate details, the careful craftsmanship, and the sense of importance that emanated from it. Mason could not help but glance at Rogue, whose calm and focused gaze conveyed satisfaction, pride, and a quiet sense of achievement, as if acknowledging that Mason had finally understood the purpose behind the puppy's behavior. Emotions surged through Mason in a way that he had not anticipated, a mixture of awe, gratitude, and a growing bond that transcended the typical relationship between human and pet. The connection he felt was layered, profound, and charged with an energy that seemed to bind them together in a shared understanding of something greater than either could have predicted. Mason's mind raced, reflecting on every subtle cue, every movement, every tilt of Rogue's head throughout the day, now recognizing the intention and intelligence behind each action. The realization struck him fully. Rogue had not been acting randomly, nor had the puppy simply been curious. Every sniff, every careful step, every pause and glance had been calculated, orchestrated to lead Mason to this exact moment, to reveal this exact truth. A lump formed in Mason's throat as he looked down at Rogue, feeling the full depth of the puppy's loyalty, intelligence, and insight. There was an unspoken understanding between them now, a silent acknowledgement that Mason was seeing not just the object itself, but the careful guidance, the patient teaching, and the unwavering attentiveness that had brought them to this point. Tears threatened in Mason's eyes as he realized the extraordinary nature of the bond, the trust, and the quiet heroism that Rogue had demonstrated without a single command or expectation of reward. Every sense Mason had was heightened in the room. The fading light, the soft rustle of the air through the windows, the subtle hum of the house, and the focused, measured presence of Rogue at his side. The day's ordinary activities had transformed into an extraordinary journey of discovery, patience, and revelation, with Rogue leading the way with an innate wisdom that Mason had never imagined possible. A warm sense of gratitude and profound respect settled over Mason as he set the object down carefully and turned fully to Rogue, meeting those deep, intelligent eyes that seemed to hold the story of the day within them. He reached out to gently stroke the puppy's head, feeling the calm and steady pulse of life and intelligence beneath the soft fur, realizing fully that this moment was not simply about what had been discovered, but about the journey, the guidance, and the extraordinary companionship that Rogue had provided. Mason exhaled slowly, a mixture of relief, awe, and deep appreciation washing over him, understanding now that Rogue's actions had not only revealed something important, but had also forged a bond that would stay with him for a lifetime, a silent testament to the puppy's remarkable awareness, patience, and unwavering dedication. The room seemed to shimmer with a quiet energy as Mason set the object carefully on the counter and took a step back to absorb the significance of the moment. Rogue remained alert, ears flicking at the faintest sounds, eyes locked on Mason as if measuring his response and gauging the impact of the revelation. Mason felt a rush of appreciation and deep gratitude, recognizing not only the importance of what had been discovered, but also the extraordinary effort, patience, and intelligence that the puppy had invested in guiding him to this point. Each subtle movement, each carefully timed pause, every tilt of the head, and attentive sniff throughout the day had led seamlessly to this culmination, creating a journey that Mason now understood in its entirety. He crouched down to Rogue's level, meeting the calm, steady gaze of the puppy whose quiet presence had commanded attention and respect from the very first moment. Mason could feel a wave of relief wash over him, mingled with awe, as he realized that Rogue's behavior had not been random or whimsical but deliberate, purposeful, and infused with a sense of guidance that transcended ordinary companionship. He extended his hand to gently stroke Rogue's fur, feeling the warmth and quiet assurance that radiated from the puppy as if signaling, without words, a mutual understanding and a bond that had been silently forming all along. Mason exhaled deeply, the tension and curiosity of the day giving way to a profound sense of clarity and connection, recognizing that this had been a shared experience in every sense, with each step, glance, and gesture meticulously contributing to a moment of discovery that was both extraordinary and deeply personal. Rogue shifted slightly, settling closer to Mason's side while maintaining vigilant awareness of the room, a subtle reminder of the puppy's dual role as both companion and silent protector. Mason reflected on the hours that had passed, the careful observation, and the attentive responsiveness that had made the day feel charged with anticipation, each minute building toward a crescendo of understanding and revelation. A warmth spread through Mason, a mixture of joy, gratitude, and a quiet emotional resonance that affirmed the connection he shared with Rogue, an unspoken acknowledgement of the trust and loyalty that had been established. Every detail, from the careful pacing to the measured glances and silent communication, now took on new meaning, illustrating the depth of Rogue's intelligence and the extraordinary nature of the bond they had forged. Mason felt his heart lift as he realized that the day's events were more than a simple unfolding of curiosity. They represented the culmination of patience, attentiveness, and instinctive guidance, with Rogue serving as both teacher and guardian, showing Mason a level of awareness and care that left him humbled and inspired. The house was quiet now, the sun dipping lower outside, casting long shadows that intertwined with the warm glow of the interior light. And in that serene moment, Mason understood fully that this experience had transformed not only his understanding of the puppy, but also his perception of connection, trust, and the subtle intelligence that can reside in the smallest of creatures, leaving him both awed and profoundly grateful for the presence of Rogue in his life. As night fully settled over Mason's home, a quiet sense of fulfillment and wonder enveloped the space, and he could feel the extraordinary journey of the day finally coalescing into a deep, lasting understanding. Rogue rested close by, ears still perked, eyes glinting with the sharp intelligence that had guided Mason through every moment of discovery, anticipation, and realization. Mason sat back in his chair, gazing at the small object that had captured their focus, feeling an immense sense of respect for the puppy's patience and wisdom. He thought back over every step, every glance, every pause and deliberate action that had led to this point, recognizing now that the day had been a carefully choreographed experience, orchestrated in ways that only Rogue could have navigated with such precision. The bond between them had deepened profoundly, each aware of the other's presence in a silent, yet meaningful communication that transcended ordinary understanding. Mason gently scratched behind Rogue's ears, feeling the soft fur beneath his fingers and the warmth radiating from the small body, realizing that the puppy's extraordinary attentiveness and guidance had not only revealed something remarkable, but had also imparted a lasting lesson about observation, patience, and the value of trust. The evening air drifting in through the open windows carried the subtle sense of the neighborhood, and Rogue's alertness never wavered, a testament to the enduring awareness and loyalty that Mason had come to rely upon. Mason felt a surge of gratitude, mixed with awe, as he understood that Rogue had been quietly shaping his perception, guiding him to notice details and subtleties that he might have overlooked, instilling a sense of wonder and a realization of the extraordinary potential that could exist in the smallest and most unassuming of creatures. The room, bathed in the soft glow of ambient light, seemed to pulse with the quiet energy of their shared experience, and Mason reflected on the day with a profound sense of satisfaction, knowing that every observation, every moment of tension and curiosity had been part of a larger, meaningful journey orchestrated by the puppy's innate intelligence and insight. As he rose and moved through the living room, Rogue followed closely, stepping in rhythm with Mason, maintaining the subtle vigilance that had been present all day, reinforcing the bond of mutual trust and respect. Mason felt the weight of responsibility and the depth of companionship settle comfortably around him, a recognition that the extraordinary events of the day had not merely been about what had been discovered, but about the connection, loyalty,